Welcome to the Burn Bag Podcast. My name is Andre Gonoella, and I'm being joined by my co-host Ryan Rosenthal, and we have a very great episode today with Farah Pandith, who was appointed the first ever special representative to Muslim communities in June 2009 by Secretary of State Hillary Clinton, and traveled to almost 100 countries in that position. After serving under both Secretaries Clinton and Kerry, she left government, and Farah also worked at USAID, also on the National Security Council, and has served under Presidents George H.W. Bush, George W. Bush, and Barack Obama. So you can really tell that her work is very bipartisan and very important to national security. And she is considered a world-leading expert in countering violent extremism, and her work and career is the subject of today's interview. So Farah, thank you so much for joining us. We really appreciate you coming on for this important topic.
I'm really delighted. Thank you for having me.
So Farah, my first question, broadly speaking, what has US government outreach looked like to Muslim communities globally since 2001?
Well, it's a great place to start because we need to back up before the attacks on 9/11. As your listeners will know, the US government engages with communities all over the world through their embassy programs, public diplomacy, and cultural programming, and a whole host of different things. So engaging with communities is no new thing for the US government. However, after 9/11, because Al-Qaeda had a very corrosive narrative that America was at war with Islam, we had to reorganize how we were thinking about puncturing that narrative. We couldn't just do what we had done before. We needed to scale up the building of bridges, the way in which we listened, how we thought about the diversity of Islam around the world. And that pivot allowed us to think, I think, quite creatively about how we could program through our embassies and how we could think about all these themes that I've just described, the diversity of Islam and other things. But what's important too is that we were also really keen on making sure we were looking at the younger generation. So it wasn't just going to people that we had long-standing relationships with the US Embassy. We were engaging with youth, and we were listening to how they thought about themselves, what was happening in the world. Let us remember that 20 years ago when 9/11 happened, it's dramatic now. You can imagine what it was then, when suddenly Muslims around the world were feeling a spotlight like never before. And they were angry about that, and they were confused about how to navigate through some things. And they were eager to sort of tell their stories about what they were experiencing in the country. So US engagement with Muslims after 9/11 was unprecedented because we had never had such a horrible thing happen to our country in this way, in the ways I've just described, but also not just the pace of things and the scale of things, but the way in which we decided to do this. So we began asking our embassies to think about new kinds of programs, both on the ground in countries, but also how we brought Muslims from around the world to the United States. And could we do more things to actually build those kinds of bonds? And we did that. I think just the final point that I'll make, which is a really important one, when we think about, and I know we'll get to sort of the meat of some of this, but for the most part, most Americans think about Islam when they think about the Middle East. And they don't realize that more Muslims live outside of the Middle East than in it. And one of the most important components of the engagement strategy post 9/11 in both the Bush and Obama administrations is that they weren't just talking about a region. They weren't just saying, we're going to just talk about the Middle East and it doesn't matter what else is happening. We were looking at Muslims that were living as minorities in Europe and in other parts of the world. We were saying that we were giving dignity to the voices of all Muslims around the world, whether they lived in a place as small as Zanzibar or as large as Malaysia. And that, to me, is an essential component to understand as we think about sort of the crafting of the strategy.
And so we're certainly going to touch on all of those key points that you mentioned, but I want to go back even further in time, Farah, and talk about your professional background, kind of how you got your start and what got you really interested in basically your life's work, this global affairs perspective, going into understanding radicalization and political violence, and also engaging with Muslim communities. And so what kind of drove you to engage in such a career?
It's a great opportunity to tell your listeners that you can never predict what's going to happen in your life. I will say two just essential things. One is I wasn't born in this country. I was born in Kashmir, and I came to the Boston area when I was a baby. And that's important because growing up, I had an international perspective because there were my grandfather was in Kashmir, my aunties and uncles and cousins, a majority of them were in Kashmir, and every summer we would go to Kashmir to visit them. So from the time I was very little, we were traveling on summer vacation. So I knew that the world was bigger than just New England. Okay, that's first. Secondly, I was, because of this idea of sort of the internationalness, I knew I was probably going to do something international, but what was really important for me was doing something purposeful. And that really comes from the ethos of my family. Many of my family members are physicians. We're giving back to community. My mother is a physician. When she was in Kashmir, she was part of a missionary hospital. She was serving there. And so it was helping communities that were not capable of getting the kind of healthcare that they deserved through the missionary hospital. And so that ethos of giving back, of building community was really embedded in me at a very young age. It's also very much a part of my faith. I am Muslim. And so it's just sort of in the way in which I was raised culturally and spiritually. But then there's a third thing that is not so sweet. When I was in the U.S. Agency for International Development, my first job out of college in the early 90s, I had decided to go to graduate school, and I thought I was going to be studying, development, and because I had been working at AID, and in the United States, fall semester is when you start school, and so in the fall of '93 is when I was going to start graduate school at the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy, and in the spring of '93. Two of my family members were killed in Kashmir. And for your listeners who will remember that period of time, there was a very challenging time between India and Pakistan around that time, and a lot of militancy in Kashmir. And so it was a jarring experience for our family to have two relatives being killed. I didn't know so much about the conflict between India and Pakistan. I knew it vaguely, but I had never studied it. And the reason why that's important to my career trajectory is because when I got to Fletcher, two things happened. The first is I suddenly was really seized with this area subject called international security studies, which I didn't know anything about. And I suddenly was like, wait a minute, I love this stuff. You're reading the course descriptions, your heart is moving at a very fast pace because you love what you're reading about the classes. And I never took a class in development when I was at Fletcher. It went completely to security studies and international negotiation and conflict resolution and Islamic studies, but that's okay. Secondly, because of what happened in the spring of 1993 with my family, a couple of professors at the Fletcher School knew who my family were, and they said, "Oh, so you're from that family, and you're not going to be studying what's happening in Kashmir?" And I said, "No, I just don't think I want to do that." And they persuaded me to think about that a little bit harder. And then they gave me 2 security study grants to go to Kashmir in the summer between my 2 years. So the summer of '94, I was in Kashmir under the radar screen. It was my James Bond summer. And I went in to interview militants. And it was an extraordinary experience because, now looking back on it, I can't believe my family let me do it. But secondly, nobody in my family knew I was doing it except for my mom who was in the United States, and one of my uncles in Kashmir who helped me navigate through this. Everybody else thought I was on summer holiday. The Indian government didn't know what I was doing. The Pakistani government didn't know what I was doing, but I was interviewing these militants. And what it did was it made me understand how youth were thinking about themselves and their own agency and what was important. And it was the seed that was planted for me as I began to think about how emotions and psychology get affected by political things that are happening around. And I ended up writing my master's thesis on the insurgency in Kashmir based on interviews I did with militants and Indian government officials and others. So put that aside, that summer of 94, fast forward in time, even though I did that, I didn't think my career was going to be around extremism and radicalization or fighting hate. I looking back on it, I can see the breadcrumbs that led from one thing to the other. But when 9/11 happened, I was working in a law firm in Boston, and when the event happened, it was I had a visceral reaction. Not only was I in Boston where one of the planes left, but I remember thinking, oh my God, I hope this has nothing to do with Islam. I didn't know enough about AQ. I mean, I knew about the 93, bombing on the World Trade Center, about the USS Cole, of course, but I didn't know that much about Al-Qaeda. And suddenly this terrorist organization is trying to define my country, America. It's trying to define my religion, Islam. It's trying to tell people how to be Muslim, like as if they were. It made me really angry. And I went into my boss's office and I said, we've just been attacked. I have this graduate degree and I think I can be useful. I don't care what I do, but I feel like I need to serve. And can you help me get to Washington? And that's how I went back into Washington in the Bush administration in 2003. It took a couple of years for me to get there because security clearances do take time. But what I thought I was doing, quite frankly, Ryan, was I thought I was going in for a couple of years and then, doing what I needed to do. And I didn't have any, we couldn't have predicted how this was going to go or what I was going to do. But what it did is it gave me a chance. I went back to AID. I was working on Muslim, and I was chief of staff for the USAID for the Asian Near East Bureau. I got to see some of the things that we were thinking about in terms of Muslim engagement. I went to Kabul for a couple of months with AID and came back, and the White House was just building their infrastructure around what we now are calling Muslim engagement. And they had heard about me and asked me to interview for a job. And from there, things just went forward.
So when you returned to public service in the early 2000s in the aftermath of 9/11, and as the Bush administration was building this infrastructure, I remember reading one of your tasks was to develop Muslim engagement strategies across Western Europe, especially in the aftermath of the Danish Cartoon Scandal. So my first question is, how integrated were these Muslim communities within broader Western societies in Europe? Were they very insular?
It's a great question. And let's remember, just because it's important to put context together, when the Danish cartoon crisis happened, it was 2006-ish. And let us remember what technology was like at that time, okay? There was no Twitter, all right? Google was just, Facebook was, these are like little babies coming into the world, right? So the idea that something that happened in Copenhagen could affect a life in Kabul was brand new. We couldn't understand, like this viral thing is very normal for everybody today. We couldn't understand it, that our embassies had to be protected around the world because of this thing. We weren't prepared. And what it made us ask ourselves is, what do we know about what's happening on the ground? And how can we think about these communities in different ways? Because that's not the way we were thinking. If you have a model of understanding of what you think is taking place and suddenly everything is turned upside down, your response ought to be, we need to learn more. And that's really where this came from. And so when the Danish cartoon crisis happened, Ambassador Dan Fried, who at that time was the Assistant Secretary for Europe and Eurasia, but had been at the NSC as Senior Director for Europe. And I had gotten to know him while I was at the NSC. When the Danish cartoon crisis happened, Dan smartly asked different kinds of questions. and said, how can we be thinking about what we know about these communities across Western Europe, and how can we get to know them better, and what can we do? What should we be doing to build stronger bridges? And so what ended up happening was sort of a new pivot, a new change in the way in which we thought about these communities, where embassies were already, as I said at the beginning of our podcast, they are already doing engagement. It wasn't like they suddenly had to do something they hadn't done, but we were being more strategic about how we were thinking about things. We were looking at younger generations. We were opening up the aperture of the kinds of people that we were wanting to talk to. So it wasn't just the head of an NGO or somebody who had the largest, megaphone. It was, we want to get to know the texture and the contours within Germany, within the Netherlands, within Italy, within Norway. Pick your country. We don't just want to go to the capital city and say, tell me about your Muslims in this country. We wanted to talk to the grassroots. We wanted to hear voices that we hadn't heard before. And what we uncovered, so basically I left. They asked me to leave the NSC and come to the State Department to work for Dan. And in that role, traveled to 19 countries within 2 years, 19 countries and 55 cities across Western Europe. And what was I doing? I was talking to people about what it felt like. And what we learned is, depending on the generation that we were talking about, and this is so obvious now, let us remember how obvious this is right now, but then we didn't have that mapping in our head. We were, it's not like some monolith Muslims in Europe. What generation are you? Are you third or fourth generation Brit? Are you a third generation German? Are you a first generation, are you a first generation in Norway? Like, where are you in how long your family has been there and where you've come from and where you're living and what you're doing? All of these things matter. And what we found is that so there are two outliers, okay? And I'm sorry to get into details here, but I think it's important. One of the things that was surprising for me is that across Europe, no matter what country we were talking about, whether it was a country that colonized or didn't colonize, there was one data point that connected across generation and country, and that was identity. Every single Muslim that we talked to that was younger, under the age of 30, were asking questions about who they were. What is the difference between culture and religion? Can I live my life here? Can I be a brown-skinned, brown-eyed, brown-haired, Pakistani Norwegian and still be Norwegian and still be Muslim? Like, will I fit in? These were questions around identity. Whether I was in Sicily, I heard the same thing of people who were second generation Tunisian Italians. I heard the same thing of third generation Turkish Germans. I heard the same thing of fourth generation Brits who came originally from South Asia. It didn't matter. That I heard. But outside of that, Dandre, that's the only commonality, because everything else varied. Was there a legacy of colonialism? Did that carry a weight within these countries? The two countries that were complete outliers and didn't fit into any norms, one was the UK and one was France. France was the country that had the most number of Muslims in it, the percentage-wise. But because there was a lot of different kinds of things that were happening that those two countries didn't fit into. I also will tell you, it wasn't just because they colonized, it's because of the way in which they were thinking about their population. So France had a whole thing about, we don't see religion, laïcité. They were claiming that, in fact, everybody's the same. We all treat everybody. There was a whole conversation going on over there. What was also interesting were efforts within particular countries around how they saw the other. So you would see things like in the Netherlands, and I've forgotten the word right now in Dutch, but there was a word that in Dutch means the outsider. And that's how they described Muslims. That was the word that they used. So no matter if you were a third generation, Dutch, Muslim, you were always labeled that way. And so what I heard from them was, I can be a doctor here, or I could be a teacher here, and we have a house here, and our family is going to live here until we die, but we will always be considered an outsider by the way in which we are talked about. I heard in Germany, we can't, at the time, there was this whole thing going on about the building of mosques. We have no place to this happened in Switzerland too, and the minaret thing. So there were all kinds of problems in sort of the functional flow of living in society, even in sort of paying your taxes for where you get buried. So there was a problem with the laws in Germany, because if you were Muslim, the money that you were paying was going towards Christian cemeteries, and they were not going towards a place for Muslims to be buried. So all of these kinds of things that we might maybe seemingly don't think about, it's the day-to-day functionality of how you feel within a community. Not just can you access the kinds of food you want to eat or pray where you want to eat, is how you're being treated, and if you feel like you're being felt like you have that agency. So the question is not an easy one to answer, and so in some places there was a sense of, we've been here for generations, we feel very comfortable, there's no issue. In other places, it didn't feel that way, but there was no perfect spot, let me just tell you. I didn't come away going, oh my God, Spain got it right. It was perfect over there. There's no problem. And what was interesting about 2007 and 2008 when we began to do this work is that countries themselves were unpacking their Muslim populations and having that conversation in a really different kind of way. I talk about this a lot in my book, How We Win, actually, because it was America in many ways was driving the conversation and making countries talk about their Muslim populations, because we had this senior person who was running around talking to their communities, and they're like, what is going on over here? Why is Farah in Cordoba? Why is she going to, these places? And because we were trying to learn, and what we ended up doing, I think, is reorganizing our thought process of the diversity of Europe and what was actually going on at that moment in time. And I wish we had been able to talk about it without the heavy pressure of the 9/11 component attached to it, because it both became a conversation around identity, but it also became a conversation for many around threat and fear. What could happen to these populations because there are bad guys out there trying to recruit them, and could they be radicalized? So both of these things were competing at the same time.
Farah, I'm now reminiscing about my college days. I read a great book called Multiculturalism and Its Discontents by Keenan Malik, which kind of addresses all the things you're talking about. And so it kind of sparked in my mind. And of course, Dan Fried is someone we had on the podcast. He's a brilliant man, and I'm so glad that you did this work with him.
So am I.
Right, yeah,
so am I. It was a true gift to work for him.
Again, yeah, he's had an incredible career, and so that work is crucially important. But while the U.S. was engaging with the Muslim communities, and something we learned in the aftermath of 9/11 is the importance of information sharing. And so what you guys learned through your tour around Europe, did you share that information with our European partners? Were they receptive to America's perspective on the conversations with these communities?
Yeah, it's a really funny thing. And I will tell you, there were those in Europe who were very confused about the fact that there was somebody in the Europe bureau who was running around Europe talking to their Muslims. Okay, who is she as an American doing this, and why is she doing this? There was one country that I talk about in my book, How We Win, France, whose ambassador, said, how would you like it if we came to your country and began to talk to your minorities? And by that, we mean Hispanics. And Dan Fried's response to that was, that'd be great. You should come over and definitely do that. And so we were actually, it's interesting, Ryan, that you're asking that question, because for the most part, European nations were partners with us in trying to uncover things. They were seeing things through our eyes. We were all sort of working together to figure out how we can build better bridges. And they didn't always like what I had to say about some things, or what we uncovered, I make it sound like it's some sort of spy novel. No, I mean, you learn things. What are we learning about these communities? But also, we got to a point by 2007, I'm not even kidding you, where European ambassadors, when I got back from these trips, were coming to us at the State Department and asking for debriefs on what we learned. And European nations were asking us, which NGOs should we go to? I mean, these are countries, these are people in their country. Who should we reach out to on this and that and the other thing? And I thought that was, I mean, it's funny on one way, but on the other, like, great, we're a team here. Let's do a better job of building these bridges. And one of the most exceptional programs that we built in that time period was sort of the pilot for a ripple effect that happened over the course of the next 10 years. And that program was started, we brought 50 young Muslims under the age of 30 together, who I basically had talent scouted around Europe. And I thought, this person from Sweden, this person from Spain, this person from Italy, can we bring them all together? They haven't all been together. Like, so there was no place where the same kind of mobilization was taking place. And we could be the convener, and we could be the facilitator, and we could be the intellectual partner, and bring them together and say, you guys need to know each other. And that was in my view, the most important thing we could be doing, because I had these conversations. I knew that the person that I was talking to, you know, in pick your place, you know, Dusseldorf, should be speaking to the person in Rotherham. I could figure that out, and I knew that more could be done. So when we brought these people together over the course of 4 or 5 days, they had never, you know, expected to see that kind of overlap in terms of ideas. And we seeded was a pan-European network of change makers, Muslim change makers under the age of 30. And it wasn't just that happened. What then happened is, through that, other things were born. So we started to see, if you follow the trail of that one, you know, beginning thing, and you see what happens, you look at what these people are doing now, all these years later, and they will trace back and say, we hadn't thought that way. We hadn't thought to work together in this way. You look at the Concordia Forum now that Mudassar Ahmed and Zahid Amanullah are doing every year. They will tell you that happened because they saw the model, and they said so much more can happen. And I believe very strongly that leadership development in change makers, you've got to play it forward. You can't just be like, you're good, you know, you'll be a leader forever. You've got to say, what are you going to do with this agency? And how can you look to the next generation to give them a lift also? And so all these years later, lots of things have been born. And I'm really proud of the group that came together, you know, all those years ago to do that. But I'm also really proud of the work our embassies did to actually think differently about who they could put around that table.
So you mentioned the reception of some of our European partners to your work. You talked very glowingly about, of course, you know, our embassies and so on, but how did US officials in the executive and legislative branches, I mean, how do they understand Muslim communities globally, and how do they understand your work specifically across the world? I mean, how much of your work may have been, say, curtailed by ignorance within the US government, as in certain actors within the US government?
I wrote a book called How We Win, based on my time in the Bush and Obama administrations, where I unpack that exact thing. Not because I need to be a martyr in any way, shape, or form, but I think it's instructive to understand the roadblocks on something that is so obvious. Soft power should be where we put our time and money. We have to do more to build bridges. We have to understand cultures. We have to learn about new generations. We have to forecast trends. All of these soft power things where you're communicating are essential tools for diplomats. And yet, to answer your question directly, it was hard. It was very hard. when I first started this work in the Europe Bureau at State, the other regional bureaus were pissed off. They were really pissed off. Like, what are they doing? Why are they everything Muslim at the State Department was the NEA Bureau. It wasn't even Africa, where, I mean, the majority of Muslims, it was the NEA. NEA had the bottom line on clearance of any documents that went to the secretary that touched the word Muslim or Islam. Okay, so something could be happening in Malaysia and the NEA Bureau would get the final, I mean, like obviously the EAP Bureau wrote the whatever, but NEA would also have a say. It seemed really odd to me. So I was really irritated because I thought to myself, giving dignity to every regional bureau is important here, because the Muslims that like, if we as Americans believe that all people are equal, there is no hierarchy of what a real Muslim is and what somebody else is not. I don't care if you're Ismaili, I don't care if you're Shia, I don't care if you're Bora, I don't care if you're Sunni. We should not care as US government. We are engaging. We don't say that's a Baptist, that's a Episcopalian, that's a Lutheran, we're not playing that game with Christianity. And I refuse to be part of something that was like, so it was a very odd thing to do for Europe to take that sort of stance, like we're going to change the clearance, we're going to make sure that everybody is taking part in this. One, so there's a bureaucratic component to this that was very bulky and very difficult. Two, money. Everything is money, 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 money. So where's the money coming from to do these programs? Whose money is it coming out of, right? The first program I ever did in Europe, there was no money in the Europe Bureau to do it. I got it from somebody who was doing public-private partnerships in the NEA Bureau, because she was so convinced of how important it was that she gave me a little bit of her money to get this thing off the ground. And people were like, wait, what? And I said, it's not about owning the pot of gold. It is about distributing it so that we are doing a better job of understanding what's happening with millennial Muslims globally. And the only way we can do that is to activate these kinds of programs. So there was a fight around money within state, and we haven't talked about my role as special representative, which was even more complex on that. But as we started Muslim engagement, it was not easy on those two things. But thirdly, and this is really important, why was I able to do the work that we were doing, in the Europe Bureau? Because the NSC saw the value of it. They're the ones who understood we've got to reframe how we're doing this. So I felt, my whole thing was, don't break any laws, make sure that the secretary and Dan are okay with it, but also make sure that the NSC is all right with it, and then go. So I was sort of like this very weird floaty person at State that was allowed to do this stuff. It's just bizarre when I think back on it. But that kind of creativity and that kind of runway was given to me by people that believed it needed to be done. So that's that portion. On the Hill was a completely different situation. That was, and it still remains today, a puzzle to me, because we can spend, and I'm not saying don't spend money on kinetic warfare. I am saying, can we do a little bit of a better job of distributing our money in soft power? And it was impossible to have a conversation on the Hill around this kind of thing. It seemed kind of sweet. It was kind of a sweet thing to do, to talk to those Muslims, this bridge building. Isn't that a sweet thing that they're doing? There's no real thing. Al-Qaeda came after us. We're going to go after them. We're going to drop bombs. We're going to put troops on the ground. That's what's going to get it. It's like, hi, the ideology recruits. And if we don't work on the ideology, we're going to have a problem. And 20 years later, look at where we are. People are still asking the question, prove to me that if I give you $1 to work on ideology, that you can tell me that 16-year-old that you did a program with is never, ever, 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 ever going to be an extremist. Well, I can't promise you that they will never, ever, ever, ever do that. But I can tell you that if you affect the ecosystem in which a young person grows up and decrease the ability for hate and extremism to pour in and inspire action, we'll have a different kind of status quo. We know this. Psychologists and anthropologists will tell you around the child and adolescent brain and what we need to do and how much we need to do between now and the time that they're 24, when the brain is matured. But Congress doesn't have time to think about that. And I can't, so I'm answering this in a very detailed way because to me, as we've watched, I mean, when we began this journey with Al-Qaeda attacking us on 9/11, and we've seen all of the groups that have happened since then, the blossoming of hate and extremism globally, the rise of neo-Nazis, I began to see in 2007 when I was going to Europe, this phenomenon that I couldn't imagine was happening, which was a rise of Holocaust denial. At the same time that people that had survived the Holocaust were dying because they were getting older. So we had this terrible situation happening and we were doing nothing. What were we doing about it? And here, now fast forward to 2021 and look at where we are. We have a rise of ideologies around neo-Nazi, white supremacists, all that kind of horrifying stuff at the same time that the ideologies around what being a real Muslim is all about are also now thriving. So we have a double whammy, and yet we don't have the money put into the effort to stop the spread of this kind of hate and extremism at the rate and at the scale that we need to make sure that we inoculate communities from finding this appealing.
Farah, I'm glad you brought up your next role at state. After you left the Bureau of Europe and Eurasia, you went on to become special representative to Muslim communities. And I'm curious how that position first came to be, and two, how your learnings and your experiences in EUR translated to your work across the world, because your role took you everywhere as a special representative.
Well, it's important to remember that when President Obama first became president, in his inauguration speech, it was a historic speech on many levels, but one of the things that he did that no other president had done was he spoke directly to Muslims in his inauguration speech. And he said he wanted to build bridges based on mutual interest and mutual respect. 3 months after that, he was in Ankara and he said the exact same thing. And he laid out for the administration a priority area, which was, we are going to reboot our relationship with Muslims. And we're going to do that in a wide variety of ways. And when you read the Cairo speech in June of 2009, you will see 15 gigantic initiatives that he was putting into play. Okay, so that's the backdrop. Okay, but when I was leaving, so in January of 2009, when the teams for the Obama administration were first coming in to sort of do transition work, and to learn about, what was going on, Secretary Clinton had asked each regional bureau for a 1-hour briefing to just give the high level, kind of stuff. And my boss, Dan being Dan, said to me, I want you to come. And I thought, okay, really? Like, this is NATO, it's the gas pipeline, it's Russia. There's no way we're talking about Muslim engagement in this 1-hour initial meeting with the secretary. But he said, no, I want the problem children to come too. And I was like, okay, fine, I'll come. So we go to this meeting in her conference room. And of course, this is the first meeting with the secretary and everybody wanted to talk to her. And the meeting's going on and on and on. And it's 45 minutes into the meeting and the secretary stops the meeting. And she says, I know that I'm going to have time to really dig deep on all of these issues, but I want to make sure that everybody that came today has a chance to speak. And that really blew my mind. And so she turned to me and she said, why are you here? And I said, Madam Secretary, I want to tell you what we've been doing in Europe. And so I started telling her everything I've just described, what we've been talking about for the last half an hour. And the more I was speaking, the more she's leaning forward in her seat and her eyes are getting really big. And she turns to Dan, who was sitting to her side, and she said, you did this in the Bush administration? And everybody just started laughing. And I thought that, it was really funny. But then she started asking me a lot of questions, like, why are the Europeans not doing this? And how are you seeing that? And so she's getting into it. And so I was planning on leaving. I had a job lined up to leave. because the Bush administration was over. And so Dan started to say, he said, when Farah leaves, because I was leaving 2 weeks later, she puts her arm on his, she puts her hand on his arm, and she moves him back, and she looks forward, and she said, "Where are you going?" And the whole room is like silent, and I'm dying, you know? And I told her, you know, where I was going to be going, and she just looked at me, and she said, "We will see about that." And I thought to myself, there's no way Hillary Clinton, who doesn't, first of all, even know me. Secondly, I've served in the H.W. Bush and W. Bush administration. There's no way she's going to keep on a political appointee to do this. But that's not what happened. And the next day, Pat Kennedy, who ran the State Department management, asked me to come to his office, and he said, you know, Secretary Clinton wants to know what it will take to get you to stay. And I said, Pat, when the Secretary of State asks you to serve, you salute. And it would be an honor. But I have to tell you that for me, what is really important is that you use what I have experienced in the last few years. I don't care about anything else, but I don't need to stay just because I need to stay. I have seen a lot, and let's utilize it. And so, Ryan, the reason why that is important is because that's what Hillary Clinton's philosophy was. It's what she said to me was, Farah, I want you to do what you did in Europe at the grassroots, all these bridge building, civil society, all of the stuff we've talked about. Do what you did in Europe, but do it around the world. And so we developed a brand new office of the Special Representative to Muslim Community. She designed that role for me, and gave me a staff and a budget and built an office for me. And I had a direct report to her, which was great. And what we wanted to do was to build as many of these programs around the world. And we developed a strategy on what we wanted to do and what the outputs were going to be and what the goals we had to reach to do this. It couldn't just be meet a bunch of people and isn't that nice. It's, are you going to seed some things that are actually going to have legs? And I was very honored to have a chance to work with her on this, and for 1 year with Secretary Kerry on that effort.
So Farah, we talked so much, I think, about long-term thinking, really, and like a lot of soft power emphasis. And I mean, I'm sure you experience this in your work, but when we're really looking at radicalization in, I think, Muslim minority countries, as you work within Western Europe, and as we've seen radicalization pop up in countries like Sri Lanka, I feel like we sort of see this like cyclical sort of situation with radicalization, right? Like, for example, like an attack occurs, a government takes stern action that can be perceived as targeting a particular community, and then more people radicalize and launch more attacks. We're not really building any peace. We're just making more and more people angry. So in your work with countries abroad, whether it's South Asia, Western Europe, Southeast Asia, Africa, how do we launch interventions to counter radicalization if some of these governments are taking harsh actions? For example, if these governments aren't necessarily being cooperative, does it falter our own abilities in this space?
Well, let's talk about radicalization first of all. It is, you're talking about the and then a cycle that happens. And I think you're not wrong in what you said, but there's a lot more to it than that. What I think has to happen is that collectively, and it's not going to be every country on earth, because every country on earth actually doesn't want to solve this problem, okay? But we do have the capacity of a large coalition of countries that do see the importance of making sure that new ideological armies are not built. Okay, whether we are talking about sympathies to groups like the so-called Islamic State or the Taliban, or we're talking about sympathies and action towards, a neo-Nazi group. Okay, all of this hate and extremism is built off of an individual's sense of self and what they are thinking about in terms of their own identity and belonging. Okay, so we're starting at a very basic point, and that is what is happening within a human to get them to start asking questions about who they are and how they can live that identity out that they think is important to them. So if you believe that you're the purest white person on the planet and you believe that that is the only thing you need to do, you're going to go find people who believe that too and can tell you what to do about it, right? And you can get some people will just be sympathizers, and some people will become violent and do things that are affecting lives. There's a lot in between. And what we tend to do is to focus on the army is already built, they go do something else, they crash people down, and then more people pop up. But there's a lot to be said around orchestrating things so that people feel that communal sense of belonging. I'm not Pollyanna. We don't have the ability of taking a magic wand and making the whole world love each other and have no hate in the world. I wish we could, but we can't. But what our effort has to be is to so value the importance of community and agency around people feeling like they can belong, that we can reduce the pool of potential recruits. That's what we should be focusing on. Because when we look at, and it's not just Muslims living as minorities or Muslims living in a majority state, it's happening everywhere. I mean, one of the things that surprised many people when the so-called Islamic State started their campaign to recruit is that you got all these foreign fighters from dozens and dozens of countries from around the world, where people were scratching their head. They're thinking, well, why were people coming from Trinidad and Tobago to Syria? What was up with that? What was happening in the Maldives? Well, if you start going to these places and asking about how they thought about themselves and how they thought about what it meant to be a quote, real Muslim, they were being fed all of this stuff that said, you have to eat this way, pray like this, dress like this, act like this. And over time, it made it an effect. It's changed, and sometimes it's a longer time and sometimes it's a shorter time. But the radicalization process happens in many ways, but the core where it begins is identity and belonging. That's where it begins. So I do agree with you that this cycle of pushback and anger and rage around what a political posture might be or action can, of course, contribute and does contribute to the feeling that we will never belong or we have no agency but there's also a lot more there that is connected to this problem that we have. And I feel very strongly that it's multiple fronts that we have to be working on in the soft power space that can recalibrate generations to think differently about how they activate. And while I may be alone in thinking this, but I do believe that solutions are available and affordable right now to do this. And 20 years after 9/11, when we have so much more information than we did when 9/11 happened about how the bad guys recruit, what they use, what they do, but also how a human decides that they're going to be okay with a brutal killing by ISIS, and even though you might be a doctor and you take the oath to protect human life, you're okay with the beheading of somebody else. We have understood a lot about that internal thing. Why are we not deploying everything that we know about stopping that radicalization process that's happening within you? Why are we not doing this at scale with every effort? Why are we not going all in? I don't get that part, because it isn't just to say this government did this really bad thing to this group, and so therefore that's why that's happening. Yes, but a lot more is happening too.
So far, we've talked a lot about the kind of state level, but also state community relations. I'm curious about your perspective on Muslim community buy-in and how Muslim leaders are working with both states and broader organizations to really do this work, because like any community, the Muslim community is, it's a strong, supportive community of each other, and leadership is important at the community level. And so what do these programs look like at the ground level as far as the communities themselves engaging in this work?
It depends on which community and what country and what state in America. I mean, it really So you said something really important that I want to underscore, which is nothing can happen if civil society is not on board. This is about a grassroots civil society effort that is supported by government, sometimes philanthropy, more needs to happen from philanthropy, business, ideally, NGOs that are working on the ground that can understand the nuances and the texture of how these programs can work. What kind of programs are we talking about? They are across the board. They are education programs. They are online and offline. They're using every tool in the toolbox to persuade you to think about something else, or to unpack something in a different way, or to get answers in a new way. They are mental health programs when people are feeling the weight of all of this and need somebody to talk to so that they don't talk to the bad guys and get pulled in that other direction. It's parental programs that help parents understand how bad guys activate online to lure their children in. It's curriculum efforts around disinformation and misinformation. You know, it's using former extremists to tell their stories. It's one-on-one interventions. We have dozens and dozens and dozens of tools in the toolbox. Why have we failed them? If we have all these tools, why have we failed? We failed because we haven't gone forward at scale. It has been ad hoc and it has been really uncoordinated. We are acting as if ideology lives only in America and it's different overseas. These are digital natives we're talking about. So for me, as I think about what the programs look like, you asked sort of the buy-in from Muslim communities. It's been scattered. Sometimes, there was a huge campaign, it still continues to this day, to redefine what countering violent extremism is. It makes me crazy because they weren't at the table. It is soft power. It is not drones. It is not policing. That is not what CVE is. But that is a fight that I'm not going to get into right now. Simply to say, there are NGOs that have made money off of the fight around CVE, okay? There are people who have made a living in our country and other parts of the world on this area, focus because they want to fight it. I have seen more people, on the other hand, who have said, I don't want to get into a political conversation about foreign policy or domestic policy. I want programs on the ground to protect the 11-year-old, the 19-year-old, the 25-year-old who's being lured in by the bad guys. So what can we do? And what I find fascinating is that we see tools in Nigeria and in India and Indonesia and in Sweden and in Denmark and in Brazil that may have different shapes and sizes, but ultimately it's coming to this sense of intervention at an earlier age when you can give that human the skills that they need to be able to push back against the ideology of the bad guys when they come forward. It's the same kind of attention that we give to our young on other things. We try to protect them from child predators. We try to protect them from other harms. We have not done our best in trying to protect our youth, our global youth, from extremist predators who are after them to build their armies. So I'm eager to see important conversations happen for sure around using the right kind of tools with civil rights and civil liberties, which is really important, no question. I'm not trying to dismiss that, but I'm seeing that there isn't enough attention on grassroots organizations and individuals who have really interesting and new ideas around this ideological fight, which we've ignored because there's not enough money for them to scale what it is that they can do. And I want to see that. And so the responsibility, in my view, for government, if we're going in that direction, is to open up our aperture on who we are talking to and how we think about things. I write a lot in How We Win about a multidimensional approach on sort of changing the ecosystem. You've got to pull the planks out in the system that's supporting extremism, for sure. We didn't talk about Saudi Arabia, and let me tell you that is a fundamental, no pun intended, fundamental plank in the system that's underlying this kind of extremism. And so that has a political piece of it. But there's also a need for us to say toward this effort, if in fact we are looking at 3 generations, Gen Alpha, Gen Z, and Millennials, which are the 3 generations that the bad guys are going after right now, how are we going to think differently about building programs that have many different touch points so that the ecosystem changes and they feel differently, so that when the bad guys try to recruit them and lure them in, they are not successful?
So Farah, my last question now, as we're rounding out this conversation, you talked about your Kashmiri heritage. You mentioned earlier in the broadcast that you are Muslim. And we had an episode recently with Gina Bennett where she talked about how her identity as a woman has helped her sort of analyze all these national security threats and has given her a different perspective than would be the usual. So how has your own identity sort of shaped the way in which you deal with these big national security challenges and your work in this space? But also another question I just want to sort of tag on there is the US government and the foreign policy space, do we have the diversity necessary to engage with some of these communities? And are we actually making progress on diversifying the foreign policy space?
2 very different questions. Let me start with your last one. The answer is no. The US government has not diversified enough on any level. Okay, they've gotten better for sure. There's no question about it. They've gotten better. It looks more diverse. But at the highest levels of around the policy table, I don't want to have to count how many white men I'm seeing. Okay, I don't want to have to make this judgment like, why are there no women at the table? Why do I not see any? I mean, like, we shouldn't be having this conversation in the 21st century. You know, it needs to be representative of who we are as America. I know that different agencies and departments are doing a better job of trying to recruit a diverse workforce. But there's a problem systemically, within the hiring and in the rising of these people, because it's not just, you can't just say, oh, 60, last year, or 20 years ago, it was 16% that was non-white, and now it's 27, and look, we've done a better job. You need to be also able to say, like, that they have risen in the ranks. I mean, there was a lot when we began to hear from President Biden about what he wanted to do about diversity in our departments and agencies, and at the State Department in particular, that there were so few senior diverse candidates for ambassador, like within the Foreign Service, because they had all been they had left, or they hadn't risen. And so you look at these things and you think, well, why? How come? What's happening within the experience of that job that people have left, or they haven't felt like they could be represented, say what they want to say. There are all these things that are going on. So I want to be clear that while change has happened, and it's good change, far more needs to happen. Okay, and I really am, I really do believe, and I really have great hope that we're going to see those kinds of changes in the civil and foreign services in our government. But I also think that the American public is also asking different kinds of questions as well. They want to see their representatives in the government look like them too. So let's be clear that that's really important. In terms of my own many different identities that I have, I think it's been really a really interesting journey for me. At times, my gender has been really important and front and center. It's really weird that I would even talk about my faith. It seems bizarro to me, because for the majority of my life, who cared? Like, nobody asked me questions about being Muslim. Why would I ever talk about my religion? I mean, that's personal. Why would I, the fact that somebody today can and do say to me, are you a practicing Muslim? Like, as if it's any of their business, first of all. Second of all, like, what does that even mean to you? You don't even know. I don't even understand how we've gotten to this place. But at different points, I think gender, I want to stress the gender piece first, because that's what people see. I think I have a very confusing name for those people who look at my name, they can't quite figure out where it's from. For those people who are from the subcontinent, they kind of get my last name, but then they look at my first name and then they're confused. So they can't quite place me. They look at my face and they often can't quite place me as well. I have been confused for many different parts of the world, which I think is a great thing, frankly. I don't want to be pigeonholed. But my gender has been interesting because when I became special representative to Muslim communities, I got a lot of pushback. And a lot of Muslims said, well, what's a woman doing in that role? She can't go into conservative Muslim communities and talk to anyone. They're not going to talk to her, which really, and my argument to that was, not only can I do that as a senior government, a US government official, and they will take my meetings, and they did, but I can also do something a man can't do. And that is, I can go into a conservative, traditional, female Muslim environment, and I will be received, and I will be able to talk to those women. So it aided me. I was never turned away. I was not asked. I mean, it was not a problem when I was special rep. The other component of that question, though, to be really frank with you, in terms of race, heritage, religion, gender, these things have played out in my career for sure in different ways. This is not a podcast about all the trials and tribulations that we all have to go through if you don't fit in a particular stereotype, but there is discrimination out there. I've experienced it in really wild ways that would shock you if I told you. I've had, and I will not name the name, I've had somebody say to me, I really want you, this was not at the State Department, let me be clear. I really want you for this job because we need somebody who's Muslim. I've had somebody say to me, I need somebody with skin color like yours and a name like yours. I mean, this is in my adult professional life, okay? It is not acceptable. That is not acceptable behavior. And yet it continues. And so the sobering moment for me in those instances and in others has been that I had been naive for many, many years in my professional career, not thinking that people saw me a particular way. And maybe some people don't, but some people do. And for them, that becomes a thing, rather than judging me on my accomplishments and my leadership skills and the things that I've done in my life. They're judging me on whether or not that Muslim woman should be the person that they put in this role. So we have a long way to go. And I'm certainly not the only woman who's ever been thought of in this way. And I won't be the last, unfortunately. But I think we've got to be really clear that even though America is having these conversations about how it is not acceptable, the fact that those two examples I just described to you happened within the last 5 years should tell you something. And I'll end by just simply saying this. I've spent the majority of the last 20 years traveling overseas in the work that I've done on behalf of the US government, and hadn't spent a lot of time in our own country. And when I did the book tour in 2019, I really spent most of the year traveling around the United States talking about how we win, because I felt very passionately that we had this moment in time to do more about fighting hate and extremism. And I felt like we had the answers, and I wanted to rally the forces to do more. And I was very engaged in this. I felt very committed. Like I saw all this stuff. I know we can do it. I want to tell you what we need to be able to do. I wanted to push the philanthropists to pay more attention to this. I wanted to push corporates to pay more attention to this. And so I was going from state to state, and I was to my horror, in many instances, I would hear from Americans, regular Americans, things that I never thought I would hear in my own country at this moment in time. So this was 2019. People would say things to me like, how did they let you work at the White House when you're not an American? Okay. Or they would say things like, this happened many times. I mean, I'm not just one off. You speak English really well. And I said, well, thank you. Thank you. I've worked really hard at it. I really appreciate that. And what are you supposed to say? So we have work to do in our country. We don't just have work to do overseas. We have work to do in our own nation about how we think about who we are as Americans and how we make sure that not just in the corporate world when they're trying to put diverse people around the boardroom table, but in the government world, that there needs to be diversity around the policy table, not just in the elected officials, but in those people who are part of our departments and agencies, who are proud national public servants, who are in the civil service, who are in the foreign service, and who would deserve to be around the policy table at high levels.
Farah, what a wonderful way to end today's conversation. We've talked about a lot of different things, and something that we always talk about on the podcast, a lot of our guests come back to it, is that diversity makes us safer. It improves our national security when we have more diversity, more voices and perspectives. And so I think that is such a crucial takeaway. And also that, there's much more that has been done and much more can be done to counter violent extremism, to improve diversity. And so thank you very much for joining us today. It really has been a pleasure. Thank you for your service. And everyone listening, please make sure to check out her 2018 book, How We Win. If today's conversation wasn't enough, you should dig in even more and buy that book and take it and dig into it. Give it a read. Thank you, Farah.
Thanks so much, Ryan. Thanks so much, Andre.